In this How-To-Svelte, we're going to create a slideshow gallery off of W3 School's How-To section. And the slideshow gallery has a number of pictures, a couple of arrows so that we can navigate through them, as well as some thumbnails so we can jump immediately to the picture. In addition to that, there's also this caption div here, and you can see that caption changes every time we select a new picture. And lastly, up in the corner is a counter here, which lets you know how many slides are in the collection, as well as which slide we're on. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We'll come down to the HTML area. And you can see there's a container here, and within the container there are several div elements that are very symmetrical in nature. So this is already going to clue us into the fact that this will be a component. And it's going to be a component representing an image. So let's go ahead and just copy this part here. We'll go back to the Svelte REPL. We'll paste that and close the div there. Now these URLs to the images don't work. At least I haven't been able to get them to work from W3 Schools, so I'll go ahead and grab my own images. Good, so we have the counter up in the corner and we have the image showing as well. Let's go ahead and grab the CSS. It looks like it's going to be for container, my slides, and number text. And the reason we can't see the image anymore is because my slides, the div with the class my slides, has a display property set to none. So if we set that to block, we can see it again. So because this right here represents an image, we're going to break this out into a component. And we'll call this slide. Let's bring over the CSS. And then we'll import this component. And then put it down here. Okay, good. So we've got that working. Now the next thing we want to do is, if we go back to W3 Schools, you can see that all of these are hard-coded in, and because we're dealing with Svelte, a component-based system, we're not going to want to do this. We're not going to want to hard-code these in. What we're going to want to do instead is make a data object that represents each of these pictures. So what I'm going to do up here in the script tags is create an array, and I'll call it images. And within the array will be objects, and each object will represent an image. So we'll give each an ID, also a name property. An image URL, and in this case it will be that. Make that a string, and then we'll also have an attribution property. So in the case of this picture, I want to be able to create a title tag that recognizes this. So in fact, let's just go ahead and do that. So in this image, we'll make a title tag, and we'll also create an alt attribute. And the alt attribute will be filled in with the name property of the data object. Now this inline style, we can go ahead and just remove that, and what we'll do is we'll put it inside the CSS area. So now what I'm going to go do is grab a bunch more images. You can also go do the same thing, get about 6 or 7 different images, and each object that you create should look something like this. Okay, so I've gotten all my images in. Let's go ahead and take this image array and we'll put it in a separate file. We'll cut this out. That way we can keep the app component looking a little bit more tidy. We'll call this image data.js. It's not a Svelte file, it's a JS file. And we'll paste this in there and we'll export that. And then we're going to import this array at the top of the app component. Good, and it shows up again. This just keeps the app component looking a little bit more tidy. So now this images array we're going to be able to use in our container here. But first we're going to need to pass some props that represent each of these things. We're going to need to do that inside the slide component. So for example, this source attribute, we want to take out the actual link to the image and we'll make a variable there. We'll call this image. And then the title, we can call this adder. And then the alt tag, we'll call this alt tag. And so then we need to declare these up here and also export them. And now these props will be available up in app because we've exported them. So let's go ahead and bring those into the slide component here. And so now what we're going to need to do is loop through the images, and we'll use a Svelte each loop. And instead of using something like image.image URL, we'll destructure this. Destructure this by putting the keys that we have listed here inside there. And so the image here is going to be represented by image URL. The alt tag will be the name, and the adder prop will be attribution. Oops. Good. So we've got all the images to show up. Next thing, let's tackle this counter up here. So inside of the slide, so 6 represents the total slides. So let's go ahead and just make another variable called total slides. And then this number right here is going to represent the slide number that we're on. So let's go ahead and make one called slide number. Then let's pass those props over to slide. We'll clean this up a little bit since we're getting a lot of different props. So total slides will be equal to the length of our array. So it's really images.length. And then the slide number will be the ID plus 1. Then the next thing we need to do is hide the images, because of course we don't want to see all of them stacked on top of each other. We just want to see one image here. So let's hide those right now. We'll set display to none. And we'll set up, let's set up a variable that will keep track of the index of the slide we're showing here. We'll call that image show index. And we'll hard code that right now to 0. And we'll make a reactive console log so we can just watch that. Okay, good. So now the question is, how do we actually get the slide to show here? And because we have set my slides, we've set all of them to display none, let's create another class, and we'll call this show. And we'll set the display property to block. Now, when do we add this show class? For example, if I put this in there now, you see they all show, but we don't want all of them to show. We want to add this class of show when this variable evaluates to true. And we'll call that variable image showing. So we'll create that up here. So this doesn't evaluate to true yet. What we're going to do is pass this up to app, and within the slide component, we'll add it here. And then whatever goes inside here needs to evaluate to true. And if it evaluates to true, then that show class will get added to that div and that div only. So we know that this represents the image, the index of the image that's showing. And by index, I mean the index of this array here. And each of these images has an ID. So why don't we make it that the image showing will evaluate the true when the ID, which we're passing through here, the ID is equal to image show index. Good. And so we only see the first image because we've hard-coded the 0 here. So it's showing the image in the 0 index of this array. And if we change it to the first index, let's do that. You should be able to see the next image. Next, next. And so you can see where we're going to go with this. What we're going to do is we're going to control this variable. And we're going to do that, if we go back to the W3 Schools slideshow gallery, we'll do that with these arrows. So every time we click these arrows, we'll advance, we'll increment that index, or we'll decrement that index. Same with the thumbnails. When we click here, we can indicate what index to set that variable to. But first, let's work on the arrows. Come back here and grab those arrows. Looks like Svelte is asking for an href, so we'll just make up one right now to make those errors go away. But these are not entirely necessary. And you can see them down here, but we forgot the CSS, and that's why they're not styling correctly. So let's come down here and grab previous and next. And there we go. Now they're showing up. And so the next thing we need to do is actually just kind of follow the clue here. There is an on-click attribute, and in Svelte we'll make that look like this instead. We'll take out this part and call this, this function will be called previous slide. Do the same down here. This function, this event handler, will be called next slide. So let's go ahead and make those. So previous slide, in a nutshell, wants to take this image show index and decrement it. Like, this is how we're basically going to start out. We'll make this, we'll refine this, but that is the general idea. And then next slide, when we click this arrow, we'll want to increment that value. So it should actually be able to work right now, but not through all of them. We now have to deal with the edge case, which is when we get down to the first image. If I click this again, we need it to go to the 7th image, which is the last image in my array. So inside of previous slide, what we'll do is we'll say So now if we get down to the first image, the very next one will take me to the 7th image, and the 7th image actually represents images.length -1. Yep, and it works. And so we'll have to do the same thing when we click this arrow. If I click this now, it won't go to the first image. It doesn't know what to do. There is no next image. So let's go ahead and create our edge case here. So now if I go up to the next image, which is 6, 7, this is the last image. I click it again, and it goes back to the first. This is the first image. If I click it going back, it should go to the 7th. So that works now. Now the next thing we want to deal with is this caption div here. We'll try to get that to render. So the caption div is here. We need the CSS caption container and caption. We can reference the array, our data array, and whatever image show index is, we'll put that in there, and then we'll reference the name property. And then we'll have to put those in Svelte syntax in order to get it to show. There we go, images. Okay, so now if I go ahead and go back, now the one thing I want to do is break this into a component, and I'm also thinking to take these arrows and move them down into here. I think that will be a little cleaner instead of putting something on the picture. So I'm going to break all of these out and put them inside of a caption component. And so we'll take the CSS out. And the way that we're going to set this up is this previous arrow will be before the caption, and the next arrow will be after the caption. And then what we'll do is we'll set the caption container to be display flex. Let's bring this in first. So we need to, we'll call this caption. And up here inside the script tags, we'll export that variable. And then inside of the app component, we need to import caption. And we'll bring that down here underneath the container. And then caption as a prop. And that prop will be set to images, image show index dot name. Okay, there we go. Okay, now coming back to the caption, we've got these on-click event listeners with handlers, and so we need to just take this part out and just make a reference to it, and we'll pass these on-clicks upward. But can you see the problem we're going to have here? We have two on-clicks. We'll take out the position absolute. We don't need top anymore. We don't need those. We won't need the right property. So these won't work because we actually have two on clicks within a single component. So what would be more ideal is if we create a custom component. And the way we do that is by importing Svelte's createEventDispatcher. We'll import that from Svelte. And then below here, we'll just make a variable called dispatch. And we'll set it to createEventDispatcher. Then down here, we'll keep the onClick. And we'll have a callback function that will call the dispatch function that we just created. And inside dispatch, we'll create the name of the custom function. So this one we'll call previous click. And then this one we'll call next click. And that's what we'll refer to these as over here in app. We'll call this, instead of on click, we'll call this on previous click, previous slide. On next click, next slide. There we go. Now it works. So by using createEventDispatcher and allowing for us to create custom names, this component now, which has previously had two on-click event listeners, can now distinguish between the two. So it knows that, oh, previous click means I should call previous slide and go back. Same with the forward slide. So then the last part we want to do is put the thumbnails at the bottom. So let's go over to W3 Schools and take a look at where the thumbnails are. And so we have an outer div called row. And then each of these divs represents one of the thumbnails. So let's go ahead and copy one. We'll know that this is going to be a component here. We'll copy the outer div. And below the caption component, and instead of calling this row, let's call this, well, let's grab the CSS first. We can go ahead and set this value to this for now, but we'll change that. We'll call this image URL. Good. So it shows up. So let's go ahead and take this class and maybe rename it thumbnails row. So it's just a little bit more explicit. And then let's set up our thumbnail component. And instead of calling this column, we'll call it thumbnail container, because it's really the container for the image here. And instead of calling this demo, let's call it maybe sample. And so what this will represent is we'll make a variable called thumb image. The alt tag will be alt tag. And then on click, we're just going to make a reference to this and then pass it up to app. But let's go ahead and declare these variables here. And then we'll import thumbnail. And then down here, we'll do another each loop. We'll destructure it. And then here's where we'll put the thumbnail component. And then in thumbnail, we need to pass thumbnail image and alt tag. And that's going to be equivalent to image URL. And then alt tag will be, we'll take in name. Good. So they're all showing up fine. And so inside thumbnail, we have this on-click event listener, but we haven't really defined what that's going to do yet. So let's go over to app, and we'll put it in here. And we'll go ahead and have that call a function called How-To-Slide. And then we want to pass in some kind of ID. So up here in the script tags, let's go ahead and define How-To-Slide. And that'll be some kind of, ID number, something like that. And we basically want to set image show index to whichever number we pass into here. So image show index should be equal to ID number. And what is ID number? ID number is the ID that gets passed in during the each loop. Let's see if this works. Looks good. Now the one thing we're missing here is when a slide is selected, everything else has a dim look to it, except for the one that is selected. So let's add that as well. And we can do that in thumbnail. There is a class here called active. So we could take demo hover away because we redefined that as sample. So sample hover actually works. When I hover over it, the opacity goes up to 1 and it's nice and clear. And as far as active, and when does this active class get added? We'll use the Svelte shorthand again, which basically says add this class active to this image when some variable that we create is true. And we'll just call this variable selected. We'll declare it up here and export it. Then we'll pass that up to app. And we'll say selected is when ID equals image show index. Yep, and you can see it's already working. So if I click it, we could actually probably just get rid of those. Keep it like that. Yeah, that's fine. So now that we have the slideshow gallery working, we can go ahead and do a little bit of refactoring. In fact, as I was doing the caption component, and I set the caption directly to the image's object using an index and then a property after that, I realized that the slide component even can be a bit more slimmed down. Right now we're looping over the slides, but we really only show one slide at a time. So it really doesn't make sense for us to render on the DOM each of these slide components only to hide all of them but one. And, we only have 7 pictures in our slide gallery, so it's not that big a deal. And you can see it's still very responsive. But imagine if we had 50 or 100 images in this. So we can take this slide component out of this each loop. And that's going to break it, of course. Let's go over to slide here. We also don't need to now have a display none property. And we don't need to have this show display block property. It'll just show display block by default. But what we do need to do is something like this. Let's now go ahead and preface each of these values. And you can see now our image shows up exactly the way it did before, because now we're just tapping into this images array directly. And now if we look at the DOM, we should really only have one div there now. Yeah, and you can see the caption is below it. And now we're rendering only one rather than 7 at a time, hiding 6 of them and only showing one, which isn't very efficient. Now the other way we can do this is to take this slide component, and you can see we're using this a lot here. So why don't we save this up here as a reactive variable? And that always starts with $:, and we'll call that image. It's just a variable name, but it's a reactive variable, and we can set it to that. So now coming down here into the slide, we'll replace all of these with image. It's a little bit cleaner. And the reactive image variable will automatically update. It will automatically update when image show index updates. Good, and this still works the same way. It's just we're now only rendering one image on the DOM at a time, and that's all we're really doing anyway. So now down here in the thumbnails, it does make sense for us to have an each loop because we are rendering all 7 of these on the screen at the same time. Captions, it actually makes sense the way we did it. We're not rendering all 7 captions, we're just rendering one at a time to match the picture. And so down in the div where we set up this class show image showing, we can go ahead and get rid of that now because we're not worried about that. And then coming back to the app component under app, here it is, image showing. So we can go ahead and get rid of this last prop as well, because we're no longer using that Boolean value to decide when to put the show class on slide, because in fact we're not using that show class anymore. We've removed it. Okay, good. And that's how you make a slideshow gallery using Svelte.